You wake up in a dimly lit hospital room. You have no idea why or how you got there, and you discover you are hooked up to a machine next to a sickly looking man. What should you do? Welcome, everyone. The above conundrum is a paraphrase of a very popular pro choice argument to justify abortion that was first presented by Judith Jarvis Thompson in 1971. While originally used to justify abortion in all cases, it is most commonly used to justify it in situations of rape. However, this analogy makes several category errors and flaws that, while sounding bulletproof, fails to actually address or show the flaw within the pro life stance. First, what is the analogy? The analogy goes that you wake up in a medical facility of some kind. You were kidnapped and hooked up to a machine to help save the life of a famous violinist by fans of this individual. This violinist, let's call him Johnny, has a rare illness, and you are the only person able to help him. Now, it varies here between blood or kidney or whatever, but that's not really important. You are told that you need to be hooked up to Johnny for 9 months and he will live. Should you be forced to remain hooked up to Johnny in order that he might live? This seems to put the pro life position in a catch 22. Either you admit that there are situations in which abortion is valid, or you are made out to appear to be a heartless individual who is acting irrationally about the well being of the person that was kidnapped. Now, Judith made this argument in an attempt to assume the pro life position and showcase that even within the worldview a pro life individual holds, they need to support abortion or they're being hypocritical at best and hateful at worst. Personally, I never liked this analogy. Not because it was hard to answer, but because it was a poor analogy and is making multiple errors and issues. First, the analogy is assuming the very thing that it uses to present the contradiction, the right to bodily autonomy. But is that actually a right? There are two kinds of rights, ones that are inalienable or inherent to us being human beings, and ones given to us by someone or by virtue of something external. For example, as an American, I have the right to a speedy trial by my peers. That is not a right due to me being human, so it's not an inalienable right. It is due to me being a citizen of the United States of America. This is different than the right to life. Nobody has the right to take my own life regardless of anything else. That is inherent to the dignity inherent to me as a human being. So does right to bodily autonomy exist? It doesn't seem to, which I know doesn't sound intuitively, but let's look at it closely. First, what is bodily autonomy? It is often defined as the fundamental human right to make decisions about one's own body without coercion. So here we see language that implies it to be an inalienable right, but that doesn't seem to match reality. As a man, I am listed for the military draft. The government has the right, in order to defend itself from threats, both foreign and domestic, to use me in the enlistment. As such, against my will, my body is forced to be used via coercion to defend this country. Even if I were to join as a non combatant, it is still against my will. My body can be forced to do something I do not wish to do. In Catholicism, you'll find many languages that seem to indicate this idea of bodily autonomy. But all of it has to do about coercion and it really being a violation of liberty. My body in Catholicism is not my own to do as I see fit. It is, it is now in service to my wife and children. And the same is true for my wife. In Catholicism, the idea of the right to bodily autonomy is not an inalienable right. Rather, we have this so that way then we can continue to fulfill our duties and responsibilities to our fellow man. Now, there's languages out there about how we are not required or mandated against our will to take care of someone, and I'll get into what that means here in a moment. However, as far as the idea of the bodily autonomy being an inalienable right, we see that our government and health officials recognize that we don't have this as an inalienable right. We do not have the right to self harm or suicide. Now, many argue that this is due to them not being in right mind so that they cannot make an informed decision. But if something is an inalienable right, that means that it doesn't matter the circumstances. It can't be taken away, or at least it shouldn't be taken away. If I have an inalienable right to life, not even I can take it away from myself. So if we are unable to do what we want to our body, even if it is to our detriment, then that means we don't have the right to bodily autonomy. We have the right to liberty, but not necessarily to bodily autonomy. And that's the first error of the argument. It is assuming what is required in order to present the contradiction. In order for the argument to bear any weight, it assumes the right to bodily autonomy, which I am not required to accept. It is not self-evident, and thus needs to be shown that we do indeed have that right. The second error is it misidentifies the right that is being violated. It's not the right to bodily autonomy that is being violated in this analogy. It is the right of liberty, of freedom. I was kidnapped and imprisoned against my will. That is the right being violated, not the right to bodily autonomy. That is a byproduct of the motivation that is leading to my being kidnapped. Liberty. The third error comes from another category error. And honestly, this is the part that upsets me the most. This analogy is attempting to desensitize abortion, comparing it to pulling the plug on life support. Firstly, as a Catholic, there are aspects that we are to follow for end-of-life treatment. Now, when the Catholic Church talks about we are not to be coerced to take care of an individual beyond the scope of their life, or that we are not to be coerced against our will for something like, say, uh, organ donation or something like that. This is in response to the individual still receiving this end-of-life treatment. So we are permitted to pull the plug or not follow procedures or be forced into those procedures that will extend the life of an individual in an extraordinary means, even artificially so. But that is not the same as actively taking their life away. We are still called to feed, bathe, and show basic human dignity to the individual. If they pass away while we provide that care, that is not us causing the death of the individual, but permitting it while we still take care of them. This is a distinction that so many people don't see within this analogy. There is a difference between taking care of a dying individual and them dying anyways, and me smothering them with a pillow. What do we see in this analogy? It is said that if we unplug ourselves from the machine, then Johnny will die, and it is equated to the same act as abortion. But abortion is not pulling the plug from life support. Regardless of a medical or surgical abortion, it actively ends the life of the fetus, either by chemical means, suction, or cutting apart. So in order for the analogy to be more appropriate, you are kidnapped, hooked up, and then instead of just removing yourself from the machine, you then decide to go chainsaw massacre on Johnny. Abortion is not letting nature take its course. Abortion is taking an active stance, not a passive one. But thinker, it isn't fair to force a woman to have a child she doesn't want, especially if she was forced into it via rape. Now, before I continue, I agree. Rape is a horrible affront to the dignity of women and motherhood. It is something abhorrent, and the criminal needs to be brought to justice. It is a horrible and terrible situation that the woman is in. She deserves our care, compassion, and support. But the act of abortion is a separate act from the act of rape and does not undo the action that was caused. This analogy is attempting to show that even in a pro-life situation, abortion is justified, and fairness is not sufficient to justify the taking of a life. But thinker, this is just the principle of double effect. You are bringing about the death of Johnny without intending it by no longer being on that machine. Just like the intent is to no longer be pregnant, and the unintended consequence is the death of the fetus. Again, no, that is not the way double effect works. The termination of the pregnancy is the death of the fetus, as opposed to me regaining my freedom, and that's not the same as the death of Johnny. I don't want Johnny to die, and I take no action that will bring about his death. I am just not taking an action that will bring about his continued existence. This is in contrast to me wanting my freedom by taking his life actively. What happens in abortion isn't wishing one and not wishing the other. They are one and the same. Abortion is not an application of the principle of double effect any more than me murdering Zach, so that way he stops being in my presence, is also a principle of double effect. Now, if miscarriages are spontaneous abortions, then desiring the termination of a pregnancy is the same as desiring the death of a fetus. Now, the purpose of this video is not to put forth that abortion is wrong or that one must be pro-life, although I think it's clear where my thoughts on that particular subject lie. Rather, this is meant to showcase that this analogy does not accomplish what it claims to accomplish. If the pro-choice crowd wants to prove their position, they need to showcase that 1, the right to bodily autonomy does indeed exist, 2, show an analogy that there is an active action being done, 3, show how the principle of double effect is indeed being followed through, 4, show why the right to bodily autonomy trumps the right to life. Regardless, this analogy does indeed fail in all 4 of those categories and should be retired. It has been kept alive thanks to the minds who have been hooked up to it since 1971, instead of letting it die naturally. Thanks for watching, and God bless.